Now, Abanindranath Tagore, when he had studied Indian miniatures, he found that there was one particular element which was missing, and that element was the element of bhava, or the emotions. And he says that emotions is a very important factor in creating a work of art, because it relates to the heart, and that is how it also gets very much individualized and it becomes distinct. And he says that this emotional quality that he brought into his art was not through line, which is an important element of all Indian miniature tradition, but rather he said he brought it through color and suffused tones. And it is this suffused tones which actually impart a very evocative and a very nostalgic character to the work, and also of the imminent death of the great emperor. He himself said that this strong emotional quality he was able to give to his painting was because of one important element, and that is the brown shawl by which Shah Jahan is covered. Now, when we look at it, we think that it is simply a representation of Shah Jahan passing away, one of the most important moments in the history of Indian art, of India, political history of India. But what one needs to observe here or to know is the fact that Abanindranath Tagore represented in Jahan Ara his daughter, whom he had lost during the plague in the late 1890s. And in the father is the representation of himself. So here it is a very poignant, very evocative moment where the father is mourning the loss of his beloved daughter, as Shah Jahan is mourning the loss of his own queen, and now that he would also be into passing. So these are certain, emotional trends which could be traits rather, which could be missed out. And this is what makes it very personal. And by personalizing it and bringing in his emotions is also the point where Abanindranath Tagore marks his modernity. Now, Abanindranath Tagore, with his interest in literature, in poetry, in drama, in theatre, etc., he derived all of his themes. They came from myths and poetries and literature, and they became the repertoire of his entire landscape of themes. So we find that it is not that he looked at the outside world, but rather he looked at the literature, read it incisively, and then interpreted it according to his own contemporary sensibility. This was the most important dimension of the modernity of Abanindranath Tagore. Now, what equally happens here is that there is also a development of his technique. He had worked in Indian miniature tradition using the gouache and water, and applying layers of paint and creating his work. But now in 1903, two Japanese artists who were sent by Okakura, an Orientalist, a very eminent Orientalist who was very closely associated with the Tagore family, he sent two Japanese artists, Yokohama Taikan and Shida Shundo. These were the two artists who demonstrated the Japanese style of painting. In this demonstration of Japanese style of painting, where the paper is taken and it is dipped in a bath of water and it is removed. And first, of course, the drawing is made on it, whatever the drawing has to be done, and then it is submerged in water, removed and allowed to be partially dry. And then the outlines are reinforced and the first layer of color or tones are added. And again it is dipped in water. This multiple dipping in the water and then again putting the subtle tones of colors on it led to a giving depth to the entire forms. But at the same time, it also created a very evocative, very poetic, very suffused ambience in the painting. And it was this quality of the Japanese wash technique which made a strong appeal to Abanindranath Tagore, and he immediately adapted it and he created a large number of paintings with this technique. So we find that it is just not the theme and the style, but also the technique which he adopted was very much oriental in character, and hence it was autonomous and non-Western art idiom, which was always in search of, and that was his personal quest for an artistic idiom. Abanindranath Tagore, in 1906, created one important painting, and this important painting is known as Bharat Mata. This was after the beginning of the Swadeshi struggle, and he decided to create this work. It shows the representation of a divine feminine form standing on a white lotus with a halo around her, draped in a saffron color sari with 4 hands, and she's holding in the 4 hands, it's a representation of food, shelter, learning, and spiritual divinity. So these are the 4 aspects which is there. Now he has made it divine because there are 4 hands, there is a halo around her, and she stands on a white lotus. Despite the fact that it is the representation of a female divinity, again in his personal life, the face of the Bharat Mata was that of his daughter. So we find here that there is an intimate familiarity and there is a divine transcendence at the same time. So the face of Bharat Mata was actually the face of Abanindranath Tagore's daughter. And once again it became a very personal representation of his emotions, but it transcends the earthly reality to make it actually divine. Bharat Mata was soon absorbed in the manifesto of the nationalist art, and it became a representation of the Swadeshi art movement, and it became also the symbol for the representation of India or the Bharat as a country, as an independent country. So it became a very important symbol, and it was a small painting, but then it was enlarged to be printed on banners and carried in processions, etc. So Bharat Mata, that in that respect remains one of the most significant contribution of Abanindranath Tagore, that actually established him as a nationalist artist of great importance, where he was able to impart a quality of distinction, individuality, and most importantly of Indianness to his works. And this is where it is said that the modernity of India actually was established at the turn of the century. Abanindranath Tagore, after the painting this particular painting of Bharat Mata, and then the violent activity that he saw as a result of the Swadeshi movement, he withdrew from this entire scene. And in 1905, Havel had already offered him a position as a vice principal in the Calcutta School of Arts, which he had taken up, and Havel had given him the full freedom to perform as a teacher that he wanted. It was here at the Calcutta School of Art that Abanindranath Tagore drew around him a committed, dedicated band of young students who eagerly learned from him his style of painting, his imagery. And it was this group of artists who were responsible for disseminating the imagery that later on was to become a hallmark of the Bengal art movement. His close and very brilliant students were Shitindranath Majumdar, Asit Kumar Haldar, A.R. Chugtai, D.P. Roy Chaudhary, and Nandalal Bose. D.P. Roy Chaudhary, of course, later rebelled and he wanted to become a sculptor and he moved away. Nandalal Bose was picked up by Rabindranath Tagore later on to head the Kala Bhavan at Shantiniketan. So in this respect, we find that if the Bengal art movement had a commonality of imagery that was very fragile, very evocative, very mannered and very subtle, with moods of sentiments, nostalgia, pervading the works. It was a result of the absorption by these artists, and then they disseminated when they took up important positions in various institutions, heading the institutions. Uh, Abanindranath Tagore continued to work. He continued to work, and we find that he did a whole lot of series which were based on Kalidasa's Meghdut, or he created Arabian Night series, particularly in the 1930s. And this 1930 series of Arabian Nights is considered to be one of his most mature works, where he brings in a characterization in the portrait figures that he represents. And but the whole story, or the whole narrative, was based on his experiences of the life in urban Calcutta, and that is how he had evolved this. Later on, he moved away from all of this, and we find that it's not that Abanindranath Tagore only, related to this imagery of the representation of a female form that he had evolved, but rather he moves on as any artist who is searching and in a quest to develop his art. So we find that from the style of Indian miniatures, he moves on to being influenced by also the folk art tradition of Bengal. And he created a series of works there in that style, where there is thick lines and the forms are well defined, etc., quite opposite to the frail fragilities of the earlier feminine forms. Being a writer, being a theoretician, and very much involved with theatre, we find Abanindranath Tagore finding himself getting absorbed into the activities of George Shanko, where he took an active part. And today, Abanindranath Tagore stands as a pioneer in establishing the Bengal art movement. And this pioneering effort was because of his search for his personal artistic medium that would have nothing to do with the Western academic realism. So when we talk of Bengal art movement, we automatically talk of Abanindranath Tagore, who was responsible in pioneering it with his vision and his radical thinking. So that is how the Bengal art movement came to be established, and the name of Abanindranath Tagore seems to be very, very closely associated with it.